title of the talk, Art for Fish, although you may have seen the longer title, which is Why Would Someone Make Art for Fish? So yeah, those is going to be on slide. You may take a clip. All right, so this is one. I was thinking of this as sort of this, imagining it like a network of infinite paths. This is kind of one path towards Art for Fish. Right, so our driving question, what do we want? A thriving biosphere. Most of us probably want that. But what is standing in the way of us getting to that thriving biosphere? Which is this, at least one of the things, is this illusion of separation between humans and everything else, which is then in some ways reinforced through like actual separation in some ways, in certain circumstances. So how do we get past that? One way is these intersubjective experiences, right? And seeing others as living beings and encountering them as they are, and sort of getting to that, rather than just a peering gaze and really deep relating way. And so that's kind of the motivation. And then I'm going to talk about kind of some of the art history, other artists, anthropologists, ecologists, and ecofeminists that have kind of gotten me to this place. All right, so just a little bit of background on where I'm coming from this. Ever since I was like a kid, I've always been really trying to be working both in the arts and the sciences, working at the intersection there, kind of these squiggly lines, illustrating some of the chaos of it. And then, so studying sculpture, ecology, and evolution. I studied at Hampshire for my undergrad. Was able to bring those things together. And then in my PhD, studying entomology, sort of more of the sort of hard sciences. Although through that, I was also like spent a lot of time in the studio deepening my practice in that way. And then sort of half coming in here is the environmental humanities, which I kind of really encountered in 2018, really through Adrian and the Feverish World Symposium up at UVM, really kind of got deeper into these ideas. And so I feel like that kind of tied things together in a way. So you'd be hearing a lot of folks kind of working at these intersections. Good things, Allison. Yes, perfect. Okay, so ecological crisis. Yeah. Here we go. All right, so specifically, right, the motivating sort of disaster here is this sort of ongoing biodiversity loss, the extinction crisis, which, right, so this is birds, this is the loss of bird individuals in North America since in the last 50 years, insects, big declines globally, fish, especially migratory freshwater fish, declining a lot in the last 50 years. And this is happening sort of all over the world. It's kind of the global biodiversity loss. It's kind of our motivating factor. So as part of this biodiversity loss leads to what folks kind of are calling this vicious cycle of biophobia. Right, so we are seeing other humans less, we're seeing other species less, spending more time inside, and sort of our relationships with other species become more strained. It's kind of the no bugs in my apartment, please phenomenon. So you can see here this is the urban versus rural population in the United States over time. So over 80% of Americans now live in urban settings. So this paper that came out a little while ago, this urbanization disgust hypothesis. This is specifically about insects, but I think it probably applies to a lot of species. That when we see them less, we don't know as much about them. We don't see insects, raccoons, most other species. We don't see them that much. And so when we do see them, they're more likely to freak us out. Right? If we see a raccoon, we're like, oh, is that gonna harm my cat? Is it gonna bite me? Right? We don't know enough about them. And so then it kind of like gets into this zone of spiral kind of happening. So how do we get out of this? So Was
that too soon?
No, that's good. So one of the things that I feel like this is an Olafur Eliasson quote. I think Allison probably introduced me to this quote. This is originally in a talk Allison and I worked on a long time ago. But I think this really captures this idea that really we are overwhelmed with data and information about all of this all the time, but we're not really able to like translate that into how we relate to other beings, how we live our lives, how we sort of turn thinking into doing. And so if folks don't know a lot for Elias, and he does a lot of big, like large-scale climate change work. This is work with a bunch of like ice blocks from, I think, Greenland, like brings into places for folks to encounter. So another thinker that I really draw on from this work is Dissanayake, and she really frames this as sort of even broader than this, that reason and rationality are not really how humans have related with one another and made decisions sort of as we evolved historically. It's kind of a new thing. And so just trying to use just rationality and reason is not necessarily going to be effective. But right then, sort of the flip side of that is that what we have used to make decisions in the past, sort of like religion and ceremonial frameworks, are often not necessarily empirical. And what I mean by empirical is not sort of this sort of mighty science in the sky, but really an engagement and attunement with the world around us, with ecosystems, with fish, with other species and material and everything. The scientists are really sort of on the ground, really in attunement with a lot of sort of parts of our world in a way that I feel like is really valuable. And so thinking about how we sort of use that, but you also take into account that sort of art and ceremonies as part of that framework of changing how we live. All right, which brings us to noticing. So I feel like let me adjust that slightly. It's this edge over here. Perfect. There we go. So there's kind of been this, I found a lot, sort of a consensus on noticing as a pathway through this crisis. And so Mary Oliver talks about attention. Aldo Leopold talks about perception. So like bird watching, things like that, so that it, as opposed to consumption. Zoe Todd talks specifically about fish, about spending time on the water, learning about fish and how they're living their lives, understanding the scientific formula that fish have figured out. Hugh Raffles is an anthropologist who kind of studied people who are really into insects. Great book, Insectopedia. Talks about this, like the close attention that is demanded when we engage with other lives changes how we see and feel, disrupts hierarchy, right? This sort of human separation. And then we'll talk about this more in a minute, but it's like experience changing into ethics. And then Rob Kimmer, of course, as well, paying attention and learning from other species, other intelligences that sort of dissolve these boundaries as well. So kind of the similar themes from a lot of different folks. So this is one of my favorite art pieces. It kind of engages with this idea. This is Birds Watching by Jenny Kendler. So these are sort of large-scale eyes of 100 different bird species which are all endangered due to climate change. Birds. Yeah, birds watching. Yeah. So it's bird, yeah, exactly. So it's birds watching us, watching them, right? So this is this idea of the reciprocal gaze, kind of that it's not just a one-way looking, but that when we're looking, they're looking back, and that this looking is kind of a participatory act, and it's sort of getting us towards this re-entanglement, a reweaving of our lives. So this is, so special treat, there's 2 David Brookses in this presentation. It's pretty amazing. But this is the first David Brooks. So this is an installation piece that he did where these catfish from the Amazon are placed on these bleachers, sort of so that to kind of emphasize that like viewing sort of reciprocal gaze, that they're looking at us, looking at them, being active observers. It's great that it's fish. Okay, so my argument is that noticing gets us a lot of the way there, but that noticing it just on its own is not enough. So this is drawn on two folks, so these are both kind of from the middle of the last century. That if folks have heard the phrase, the medium is the message, heard that, right? So this is this idea that the message a media comes in on, or a message comes in on, is at least as or more important than the content of it. So the example I like to use here is like a book, right? It's like there's an author of the book, they write a monologue and then they send it to you, to one person, to many people. And it's so that the message of a book is that one person is the authority, right, the author, who's going to like write everything about a topic and send it to you, and then you'll read it and know all that, right? There's not a dialogue there, sort of monologue. Something else sort of talks about the similar ideas. So John Berger, Ways of Seeing. So I was very kind of doused about this talk. Adrian kept like mentioning things over the last few months, and I kept being like, wow, that really fits. This is one of those. So I rewatched this. And he also makes this point that television is also like a monologue, where right, like someone makes it, sends it to you. And something else that was amazing about this that I hadn't really thought about is that cameras and photography, right, before cameras and photography existed, in order to see something, you had to go to it to see it, which is so foreign to us, right? We get to see things all day, every day that we're not in the presence of. Constantly, right? And up until 150 years ago, that you couldn't do that at all. The best you could do is a painting or a drawing, right? Which is wild. So part of my thought here is, right, this emphasis on noticing and mutual seeing, I think might be because we're so used to being in like a very visual, sight-based way of relating, right? We have a phone, iPad, computer, TV. We kind of like, I've talked to Allison about this. Right? Sometimes it just feels like we're switching from screen to screen all day, right? And so, and even reading, right, is very visual. So moving from like a monologue to dialogue, it's sort of where I'm trying to go in some ways with this. So this is Val Plumwood, who's like my favorite. You call me a Val Plumwood stan. Right, and so she's an ecofeminist, Australian ecofeminist writer who writes that, right, this idea that one of the most important tasks is to learn how to communicate with other species and to develop these interspecies relationships. And try to negotiate our relationships with other species. Someone else who writes about this a lot is Zoe Todd, who's a Métis philosopher, calls herself the indigenous fish philosopher, and really thinks about this way of sort of like learning with fish, learning from fish, engaging in these like deep ways where fish, right? Many of the cultures she's worked with, like in the north of Canada, fish are really members of communities and societies and are part of the decision-making processes. Sort of developing these sort of protocols of attention and noticing. So here's David Brooks number 2. Maybe not a David Brooks you would have expected to see in a presentation like this. He's kind of a more conservative, sort of talking head commentator. But this book, he wrote this book, which came out a few weeks ago, and this is from a review of that book, or maybe it's a quote from the book, I'm not sure. But I found it felt like it was, wow, this is like actually like exactly what I'm talking about. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but if folks, a lot of different cultures and stuff don't think of only humans as persons. You think of many different types of beings as persons. So one of the benefits of using that, thinking about other beings as persons, is you get to use almost anything anyone has written or talked about in terms of like human to human, and think about how that applies also humans to fish, and so or humans to other persons. And this is really sort of a great way of putting this, right? When we're trying to engage with another person, we don't just look at them. We don't even try to do a mutual gaze, right? We have a conversation. We talk to them. It's a much more deeper way of engagement than just sight, especially just single direction sight. So they do conversation, yeah. So a part of that also that he talks about, right, is that way of knowing translates into ethical relationship. And so I just wanted to pull this out. This was 3 people coming from kind of different places, but all sort of having sort of a similar conclusion here of, right, experience translated into ethics. The shape of our knowledge becomes the shape of our living. And from Zoe Todd, this idea that knowing, being, and doing are actually interrelated in many sort of indigenous cultures that she's writing about. Right? You can't know things without being and doing sort of all at the same time, right? Or we might think that you might be able to know something without having an ethical obligation in that. Having those really be tied together. All right, so this was like kind of a sort of stuck out for me as a moment in this process that really stuck with me here, which is that I had a friend who was teaching a fish, which is like during COVID, I think, when all we were doing was outdoor things. We couldn't do things inside as much. But that they talked about after we gone fishing, they really, the way that they related to the lake changed. And they really cared about the lake in a totally different way. Like they'd always, love looking at the lake, and go swim in the lake, see the lake from Burlington. But it really changed their perspective once they started fishing. And sort of this idea that right, taking care of the health of the lake is sort of abstract unless you're eating fish from the lake. And so anything that goes in the lake, you're then eating, right? So this is a very different way of thinking about it, even though they're drinking water from the lake anyway. But that's a little more abstract, maybe. So with hunting and fishing, hunting especially, but right, it has this multi-species sort of what's called intersubjectivity, right? You and who you're hunting are like in this engagement of you're trying to get close to them, they're trying to figure out if you're hunting them. And so it almost, I kind of think of it as this meditation, because you're often sitting in the woods for a long time, waiting, and then sort of engaging in these like very subtle relationships, which some folks call the hunter's trance. E.O. Wilson, who is like a famous Harvard scientist, entomologist, studying ants mostly, but he also used this phrase when sort of engaging with insects. So you kind of shift into this mindset where you're really sort of deeply attuning to insects. So one of the things that kind of feels significant about this too is that when you're hunting and you're fishing, there's a measure of the success of how well you've engaged, and that's you have dinner, basically. Like, right, you know that you've been successful in attuning, and because you successfully captured who you're trying to attune with. And so there's this question here: can art take the place in some way of that sort of final success that comes from the attunement? So that's kind of an ongoing question here. So a friend who I co-teach with at the UVM introduced me to this data, which I thought was really pretty, at least to me, pretty clear empirical evidence of that relating is different than just seeing. Right. So this is what we saw before, the sort of decline in birds since 1970 across North America. And here it is broken up by sort of ecosystem where those birds are mostly found. And so what we see is that birds are declining in almost every ecosystem except for one, and that's wetlands. And that's largely because hunters and conservation organizations have a lot of hunter involvement, but work really hard to conserve wetlands for hunting, right? So for these not just visual interactions, but actually you might call it consumptive, or you might call it ecological relationships that kind of leads towards mutual thriving, right? So it's kind of counterintuitive that duck hunting would lead to ducks doing better, right? But it is kind of this different way of relating than just that. So a caveat to that is that, right, there's 8 billion of us right now, So part of the motivation for this project is that, right, if everyone in Vermont went out and got a shotgun and went duck hunting, we would run out of ducks pretty quickly. And so one thought of this is that, right, there might not actually be enough calories kind of embodied in wildlife for us to all go do this to meet all our caloric needs, right? So what do we do in the meantime? So this came out a few weeks ago, months ago maybe, in the New York Times, and has proven pretty influential to thinking about this project and sort of the motivation behind this project. So this is a population graph of sort of the black line is where we've been, and the red line is the projections of where the human population is expected to go in the next few hundred years. So what's crazy about this to me, right, we're supposed to peak in 2085, 2065, maybe around there, and then go down again just about as fast as we went up. And this isn't because of like horrible disasters or something like that. This is just because as people reach higher standards of living, like the way we live here in the United States, they have fewer kids. They have 1 or 2 kids. And so then just being below 2 brings the population down pretty swiftly. Right. So then there's this question of, right, maybe if we're over here, there's few enough humans that everyone can be engaging in hunting and fishing more. But how do we get through this chunk here, right? So maybe this multi-species art can play the role of these intersubjective relationships while we wait until we can get for those other relationships to become more feasible. Okay, so here is a crazy slide. Joel is putting this together, and it's like, wow, there's a lot of going on here. But this is like one of the core motivations, sort of backgrounds for this work and all my other work. I say the phrase "there is no magic wall." There's many different ways of, that folks have framed this. I really love this is Sharon Mitchell, who's a Penobscot writer. She uses the phrase "the illusion of separation," which I think is really apt. But Crispin Sartwell, a philosopher, I forget where, has this quote, which I think really sums this up. Right? The separation of humans from and superior of humans to members of other species is a good candidate for the originating idea of Western thought and a good candidate for the worst. So someone else said it for me. Right, but this is this idea that, so coming from a lot of sort of like foundational Western philosophy and just ways we live in, I don't necessarily want to pin it on any one in particular person, right? But humans are separate, there's a hierarchy, humans are on top, that justifies domination, right? So Val Plumwood is really, let's see her again, she's really sort of explained this in a way that I think is very clear, right? But as a scientist, right, I mean, to sort of empirical evidence and falsifiable hypotheses, right, we've accumulated enough evidence at this point that this is not whole water, right? So Darwin, right, we all have a common ancestor. Where would be the separation between us and any other being given we have common ancestors? Glenn Margulis, right, taught us about how our bodies, the mitochondria in our cells, right, this is a symbiotic relationship with other beings. Our DNA is like something like 10% viruses that we have become part of us. And of course, a lot of indigenous philosophies and cultures never had this idea. And so as we can become more aware of that, we can kind of think through this, right, lack of this divide. All right, so shifting from kind of the motivation stuff into the more art zone of things. This is what is art, right? If we're making art for fish, how do we know what art is versus something else? And this idea of making special. So this is another writer that I was introduced to through Adrian. His fingerprints are all over that. So her sort of way of thinking about this is that art is one way of making things special. And making special is kind of this evolved human behavior, which also includes things like play and ritual. These are also things that are special in our lives, but art is one of the things that is, right, the way we define art in some ways is that it is something that is made special in a certain way. And kind of an important part of this that I think about is, and this is from Daniel Dennett, like an evolutionary biologist. So folks know about like genes and the idea of like genetic heritability. Oftentimes you think like a gene for like blue eyes or something like that. Oftentimes it doesn't actually work like that. There's many, many genes that go into like even simple characteristics like that. But the model of a single gene works in a lot of ways to explain things. So part of this is like, I'm not trying to make like a waterproof or claim that this is a waterproof theory, but that it's functional enough, it works enough to understand what art is, that it works for at least the purposes of this project. Okay, so art is making special, right? So what makes something art is that, right, you take time and attention to give it meaning, right? Historically, right, art in terms of like ceremony and ritual would hold social groups together, right? Sort of have an evolutionary purpose of like conveying meaning and bringing folks together. She writes, right, in traditional societies, the arts are often multimedia. It includes music, costume, dance, other things. It's important that everybody participates, so it's not a skill-based thing. It's not like you go to art school and that's the only way you can do art, right? Everyone's included, and it's often about really sort of important things in daily life. A couple examples of that, right? And so I feel like when I encountered this series, it really just clicked for me. It really like made a lot of sense. Right, so making special means you spend time, energy, and skill to draw attention to something. It means it's important to you, and you want it to be important to others. Right, so just like basic clothes that we wear might not be art, but have like embroidered wedding clothes, right, is art, right? It's made special. Just an empty room might not be special, but we add art onto the walls, right? That makes it special. That's what allows us to create that specialness. Oh, and hold on. So also that it's sort of this idea that this is an evolved behavior. One of the reasons it feels like it really helps explain things is that like all humans that we know of at all times have done stuff like this. Like they haven't been sort of wait until someone developed a sort of theory of aesthetics before they started sort of decorating things and making things nice and making things special. All right, so has anyone heard of Fluxus? Yeah. What do you know about Fluxus?
Oh gosh, but it came up when I was in college.
Yeah, I was hand over here. Yeah.
Oh, it's like extremely experimental, unique 20th century art.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, so I actually only learned about Fluxus like a month or two ago. Sort of in any detail, but felt like, oh wow, this is like feels like really attuned to what I'm doing. So John Cage was sort of an artist sort of around at the beginning of this. That sort of this movement. I actually think they didn't want it to be called a movement. But, sort of blurred the lines between art and life, and put an emphasis on art as a site of interaction. Right. So David Lynch, the director, also talks about this, that art is this like circle thing in between you and the art. Like there's the interaction is where the art happens. So this is really sort of resonated with Dissanayake's idea around sort of the origins of art. Right, everyone's involved. Should be understood. You shouldn't need to go to school to understand it. Everyone's making it all the time, and that it's like involves all these different media together. So one of the types of work that was sort of common in Fluxus was this idea of event scores. So one of them was draw a line and then follow it. Right? That was the art piece. So if anyone anywhere did that, that was kind of considered a sort of implementation of that art. So this is another piece called The Identical Lunch by Allison Knowles. Here's a picture of it. They've kind of done it at museums in New York and stuff, but bringing this idea from Dissanayake about making it special, right? It turns this idea, right? It doesn't just make everything in life into art constantly, but when you make certain events in life special in a certain way, it turns them into art, right? So if you're just having a sandwich, that's maybe not special. But if you have this, a tuna fish sandwich on wheat toast with lettuce and butter, no mayo, and a large glass of buttermilk, right? That is the art piece, the identical one. If you're hungry, feel free to grab some snacks. We don't have any tuna fish, unfortunately. Yeah, we went back and forth on whether or not we were to serve fish. We decided against it. We have the goldfish and the Swedish fish to make up for it. Okay, so in the video, did anyone sort of recognize what the art for fish in the video was?
Are you giving us a hint?
I'm giving you a hint, yeah. Well, oh yeah, kind of, yeah. Yeah, so they're ready made, but I didn't make one of them, but most of those lures that were in the water that the fish were looking at were, right, they were kind of off the shelf, or they were lures that we used for fishing, right? So Duchamp is an artist who I really thought of when I was sort of originating this project. And his sort of bringing of mass-produced objects into the art gallery and presenting them as art. We were actually in Philadelphia, like, over Thanksgiving. I got to see some of his work there and take this, stood in front of it and took some silly pictures while trying to avoid other people going by as they were posing. Right, there's argument about whether or not this is art or not, but bringing this idea of making special to it really makes clear why it is art, which is that, right, maybe just any old urinal isn't art, but you bring it into a gallery and you sign it and you call it art. That makes it special, right? So it makes mass-produced objects into art, right? So thinking about the choices and the decisions that an artist makes into making something special, maybe more important than, right, the sort of some sort of academic art skills that we might think of in that way. And also, again, right, moving away from just a visual experience to other forms of relational experience. All right, so now we're going to talk about other species in art a little bit. So this one's highlighted in red because that's kind of like what I'm thinking about, what we're thinking about today. Two other ones, which I'll just briefly kind of touch on a little bit, is art of other species and art by other species. Then this art for other species, and then art with other species is kind of like off in the future. I don't know how to do that. But I thought I'd put it up there. Somebody might want to. Yeah, so I want to work on that. So this is photography. This is another piece by Jenny Kendler. This is kind of a process photography piece where you sit in one place for an hour and take a picture of every bird that you see in the sky above you for that hour. So this is similar to the metaphor, right? So anybody can do this piece. So, right, this makes, right, maybe this is making other species special in a way that when we're bringing them into our lives in this way. So this is some of my lantern work. This is actually in this room. I didn't think about this when I put this together. But yeah, these are the windows here that are here. This one here. That's cool. I did not think about that at all. So this is salmon and orca lanterns. These are big, so in sculpture too, right? So many mediums. You can think about art of other species, making them special. And then this is a painting about Paul Clay, goldfish, which is bringing another medium in there too. Also, sort of, I felt this was sort of visually resonant with the lanterns too, in similar colors. I still have a long history of making art of other species. So art by other species. Does anybody know what species this is? Bowerbird, yeah. So, they don't know why bowerbirds make art like this.
Does anybody?
What?
Like, does anybody?
Well, yeah. Well, not so specifically, no. Yeah. So on one level, no. On another level, like, to be sexy. Yeah. So why specifically this is sexy? That's a good question. Yeah. So yeah. So they all have like their own aesthetic preferences. So like this is a male. They build these bowers, which is where they mate, and then they decorate them with different objects. They often like pick a color and then find objects that are all that same color. So here's blue, a lot of plastic here. I guess like probably way more blue available now with all their plastics than there were in the past. But they would also get like blue beetle shells and stuff like that.
So between art and hunting, there's sex.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So one idea here, right? This is making the bird. When you're doing this, you're making yourself special. And you're making it to other bower birds. Yeah. And then a little closer to home, this is a deer. And so deer, right? So one way we can think about making yourself special is through like things like antlers or secondary sexual characteristics like that. But also part of having antlers is these rubs, right? So male deer, when they have their antlers, will make these sort of paths of rubs on them through the forest, right? So you're creating these other sort of engagements with trees, and other deer will see those and engage with them. And humans will also engage with them to see who the tasty deer are in the area, if they're a hunter. So thinking more about traps and hunting. So this, Alfred Gell's an anthropologist who wrote this paper in the 90s, Traps as Artworks and Artworks as Traps, which I think I read kind of when I was formulating this idea. So his argument is that traps and art share the same goal of capturing the audience, right? And the same as next to intentionality, right? There's this, you and like the artist and viewer, you're like trying to engage with one another through the art. And so there's like complex intentionality, right? Defines both traps and artworks. Yeah. Okay. So this is a great example of this. So I put this together. I don't know why. It's just kind of like fate, I guess. So I picked David. People looking at Michelangelo's David, and then I googled people looking at Michelangelo's David, and there was a Reddit thread where someone had taken. So these are all people. You may actually recognize these expressions from the Art for Fish video. Right. Right. So David and these lures that are put in the lake have a similar effect. Right. They, for the moment, for a time, you're held in suspension in the intentionality between you and the artwork. Sort of impedes your passage and captures you in sort of a thought trap. Yeah, what do you think, Zoran?
Interesting.
So Hermione Sprague is a British artist who kind of does a lot more with these ideas, sort of drawing on Gell a lot with decoys. And so this quote from her I really liked, right, that art, if you think of it as only by humans for humans, is a sort of quarantine of art. And if there is no magic wall, why would there be a quarantine? What sort of justification would you have for doing that? So that even though, so these are duck decoys that for when you're hunting waterfowl, they put a bunch of decoys out and then sit next to them for a long time in the mud, waiting for other actual ducks to come by, and mistaking those for ducks. Right, so there is that functional intent, but there are also, right, there's an aesthetic intent. You're trying to capture these ducks, which sort of gets us into engaging with other species, worlds of thinking, right? In what ways does this, like, we can kind of easily tell this isn't a duck, but can a duck tell this isn't a duck? What matters to a duck and what matters to a human might be different. And then thinking back to this idea of sort of more than just sight engagement, right? So this is art that is engagement with ecological processes, hunting and eating. So this is a long quote, kind of the only big block of text here, but I thought it was really sort of important for this, fit well with this. So this is from How Forests Think by Eduardo Cohn, which is this work of anthropology that is I think it was pretty transformative for me to read this, even though, and I've been meaning to revisit it as well throughout this process. So this is the quote, if you can't see this, is what a hawk looks like to a parakeet. This is kind of a scarecrow of a hawk. And so this is from the Runa culture in South America, right? And so this scarecrow, right, we can tell it's not a hawk, but it's not an attempt to realistically represent a raptor from the human point of view. Rather, it's an attempt to imagine what from the parakeet's perspective, what a raptor looks like. It stands for a raptor, for a parakeet. And so thinking back to our ideas of like what is successful multi-species engagement, the way they can tell this is successful multi-species art or engagement is that it keeps parakeets away, right? If there's no parakeets, you've successfully created a hawk for parakeets. Right, so this allows us to know something of what it is like to be a parakeet by the effects that our guesses at how parakeets think have on parakeets. Okay, so finally we get back to art for fish. So these are 3 examples of ways of thinking through art for fish. So lures, this is what we saw in the video. Lures with the hooks removed. Flies, which I haven't done too much with. My dad was a big fly fisherman. One of the things that's really sort of wild about fly fishing is that often there's a very deep attunement to the very specific insect ecology of the day where you're fishing and the fish were there in the river. So this sort of brings in, thinking about entomology, it really brings in this idea of deep attunement with insects and fish in this very sort of multi-species mode. And then these, has anyone seen these before? Anyone encountered this? These are spearfishing decoys.
Oh.
So they're kind of maybe the most, these are all handmade often, right? So thinking about making special, those are right up there with that, right? Not mass produced. So let's go to the next one. Yeah, so I don't have a video or anything, but so the spear, these is sort of how they're made. But what you do with spearfishing decoy is you cut a hole in the ice. They're used for ice fishing. So you cut a hole in the ice and you put the decoy in the water below you. And then you wait for a predator fish to come, and then you try to spear them as they're sort of entranced in your thought trap of your decoy. So this is from a Ojibwe fish decoy maker. And what's also a really cool thing about this is that this seems to be a sort of indigenous to North America form of decoys. They probably originated around 1,000 years ago, maybe around the Great Lakes or possibly farther north. There's some like archaeological examples of them. So thinking about how we make art for fish and how fish sense the world. This is a great book, What a Fish Knows, which I wrote a long time ago. Forget most of it. And then another amazing book, Immense World by Ed Yong, really talks about, right, thinking about when we're engaging with other species, that the way they sense the world can be, right, there's an overlap. Right? We have sight, smell, hearing, sound, that are sort of, we share those with other species. So both acknowledging those overlaps while also acknowledging the differences. So fish have lateral lines along their side that allow them to sense water pressure and movement. Some fish can sort of sense electrical fields. Other fish can sense magnetic fields. I think salmon can for migration. This is a shared experience, but also non-shared experience too. And right, then sort of bringing back to sort of our original question here, right, can develop these intersubjective relationships with other species, this kincentric or ecological relating, move us through ecological crises into a thriving biosphere. And then maybe more specifically for this, can this multi-species art lead to sort of intersubjective experiences that we're interested in, and benefits for fish, benefits for humans. And then also thinking through these kind of, what parts of this are like the art of it, what parts of this are the science of it. Yeah, a lot of questions that I'm thinking about with this. There we go.
Woo.
So yeah, a lot of people like help with this, a lot of good Jules who I think is over there. So in addition to like really putting this presentation together, Jules edited the video, set up the snacks, and we've been like talking about this and working on this for months. Adrian for the music and a lot of these references I encountered through him. And then some folks from up in Canada, we ran a workshop on interspecies collaboration a couple of years ago there too. And I probably thank a lot of the people in this room as well for different things related to this project over the years as well. So thank you all for coming.
Yay.